a professional writer in name as well as in fact. Three things hastened the transition. The first was a disagreement with the university authorities over what he held to be a matter of principle. The second was an illness. The third was the fact that he happened to be unmarried. Not long after the publication of No Doornail This, and following the illness which had made inroads on his constitutional reserves, he wrote with only mild reluctance a letter of resignation, and went abroad to complete his fifth detective story in the Sun. It was the week after he had finished that book's successor that he went to Turkey. He'd spent a year in and near Athens and was longing for a change of scene. His health was much improved, but the prospect of an English autumn was uninviting. At the suggestion of a Greek friend, he took the steamer from the Piraeus to Istanbul. It was in Istanbul and from Colonel Haki that he first heard of Dimitrios. A letter of introduction is an uneasy document. More often than not, the bearer of it is only casually acquainted with the giver, who in turn may know the person to whom it is addressed even less well. The chances of its presentation having a satisfactory outcome for all three are slender. Among the letters of introduction which Latimer carried with him to Istanbul was one to a Madame Chavez, who lived, he had been told, in a villa on the Bosphorus. 3 days after he arrived, he wrote to her and received in reply an invitation to join a 4-day party at the villa. A trifle apprehensively, he accepted. For Madame Chavez, the road from Buenos Aires had been as liberally paved with gold as the road to it. A very handsome Turkish woman, she had successfully married and divorced a wealthy Argentine meat broker, and with a fraction of her gains from these transactions, had purchased a small palace which had once housed a minor Turkish royalty. It stood remote and inconvenient of access, overlooking a bay of fantastic beauty, and apart from the fact that the supplies of fresh water were insufficient to serve even one of its 9 bathrooms, was exquisitely appointed. But for the other guests, and his hostess's Turkish habit of striking her servants violently in the face when they displeased her, which was often, Latimer, for whom such grandiose discomfort was a novelty, would have enjoyed himself. The other guests were a very noisy pair of Marseillais, 3 Italians, 2 young Turkish naval officers and their fiancées of the moment, and an assortment of Istanbul businessmen with their wives. The greater part of the time they spent in drinking Madame Chavez's seemingly inexhaustible supplies of Dutch gin, and dancing to a gramophone attended by a servant who went on steadily playing records whether the guests happened to be dancing at the moment or not. On the pretext of ill health, Latimer excused himself from much of the drinking and most of the dancing. He was generally ignored. It was in the late afternoon of his last day there, and he was sitting at the end of the vine-covered terrace out of earshot of the gramophone, when he saw a large chauffeur-driven touring car lurching up the long dusty road to the villa. As it roared into the courtyard below, the occupant of the rear seat flung the door open and vaulted out before the car came to a standstill. He was a tall man with lean, muscular cheeks, whose pale tan contrasted well with a head of grey hair, cropped Prussian fashion. A narrow frontal bone, a long beak of a nose, and thin lips gave him a somewhat predatory air. He could not be less than 50, Latimer thought, and studied the waist below the beautifully cut officer's uniform in the hope of detecting the corsets. He watched the tall officer whip a silk handkerchief from his sleeve, flick some invisible dust from his immaculate patent leather riding boots, tilt his cap raffishly, and stride out of sight. Somewhere in the villa, a bell pealed. Colonel Haki, for this was the officer's name, was an immediate success with the party. A quarter of an hour after his arrival, Madame Chavez, with an air of shy confusion, clearly intended to inform her guests that she regarded herself as hopelessly compromised by the colonel's unexpected appearance, led him onto the terrace, and introduced him. All smiles and gallantry, he clicked heels, kissed hands, bowed, acknowledged.